According to a survey we just made up, but which feels emotionally accurate, roughly 100% of people who have ever taken a European history class have had at least one argument about Napoleon Bonaparte. Was he a military genius or a reckless gambler? A visionary reformer or a megalomaniacal tyrant? A liberator of nations or a conqueror of them? Short or actually average height for his time? That last one generates more internet debate than all the others combined, which tells you something about humanity's priorities. Here's what's not up for debate. Napoleon Bonaparte went from being a minor Corsican nobleman with a funny accent and no connections to becoming the Emperor of France, the master of continental Europe, and one of the most consequential human beings who has ever lived, all before the age of 35. He reshaped borders, legal systems, and the entire political order of a continent. He fought more battles than most people have had hot dinners. He crowned himself emperor in front of the Pope, who was sitting right there, which is either the most audacious power move in history or the most disrespectful thing anyone has ever done in a church, depending on your perspective. So how did he do it? How does a kid from a rocky Mediterranean island with no money, no political connections, and a last name that nobody in Paris could pronounce correctly end up ruling most of Europe? Was it talent, luck, timing, an abnormally high tolerance for sleep deprivation? The answer, as you might expect, involves all of the above, plus a revolution, several wars, a lot of artillery, a political system in complete collapse, and the kind of relentless personal ambition that makes modern CEOs look like underachievers. Our team researched extensively, read stacks of biographies, stared at many paintings of men in elaborate hats, and did not invade any neighboring countries in the process. Let's start where all the best stories start, on a small island that most people couldn't find on a map. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, a small coastal town on the island of Corsica. This is a significant date for two reasons. First, it marks the arrival of one of the most important figures in modern history. Second, Corsica had only become French territory the year before, which meant that Napoleon was born a French citizen by approximately 15 months. Had he been born a year and a half earlier, but he would have been born Genoese. The island had previously belonged to the Republic of Genoa, and the entire course of European history would have been different. Sometimes the fate of continents hinges on calendar timing. The Bonaparte family, originally spelled Bonaparte in the Italian fashion, because Corsica was culturally much more Italian than French, occupied an awkward position in Corsican society. They were minor nobility, which meant they had a coat of arms and a modest estate, but very little actual money. Napoleon's father, Carlo, was a lawyer and political operator who had initially supported Corsican independence from Genoa and France before pragmatically switching sides and aligning with the French once it became clear which way the wind was blowing. This instinct for reading the political room and adjusting accordingly would prove to be a genetic trait. Napoleon was the second of 8 surviving children, which meant that the family's limited resources were stretched thin. He was, by most accounts, a difficult, combative, intensely competitive child who got into fights constantly and displayed an early talent for leadership, primarily by organizing the other children into military formations and bossing them around. If you're thinking, this kid sounds exhausting, you're probably right, but you're also looking at the early behavioral profile of a future emperor. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France to attend school. This was a pivotal moment and not a particularly happy one. But Napoleon spoke French with a thick Corsican Italian accent that his classmates at the military academy in Brienne-le-Château found endlessly hilarious. He was short, though probably not as short as popular mythology suggests. He was likely around 5 feet 6 inches or 5 feet 7 inches, which was about average for the time. But we'll get to that. He was foreign. He was poor by the standards of his aristocratic classmates, and he had a name that sounded funny to French ears. The other boys bullied him. Napoleon, characteristically, responded not by crying or trying to fit in, but by withdrawing into books, studying obsessively, and developing a burning, white-hot resentment of the French aristocracy that would serve him remarkably well during a revolution that was at that point about 15 years away. He devoured histories of ancient Rome, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, men who had taken power through a combination of military brilliance and sheer force of will. If his classmates were going to treat him as an outsider, he would become the kind of outsider who conquered everything in sight. If that sounds like the origin story of either a supervillain or a world historical figure, well, with Napoleon, the line between the two was never entirely clear. While we're on the subject, let's address the height thing. The idea that Napoleon was exceptionally short is one of the most persistent myths in popular history, and it's mostly wrong. The confusion stems from a difference between French and English measurement systems. Napoleon was listed as 5 feet 2 inches in French measurements, but French inches were longer than English inches. In English measurements, he was about 5 feet 6 or 7 inches, which was roughly average or slightly above average for a Frenchman of his era. The short Napoleon myth was largely a creation of British propaganda. Caricaturists in London loved drawing him as a tiny, angry little man, and the image stuck with a persistence that would have driven Napoleon himself absolutely crazy, which was, of course, the point. His nickname, Le Petit Caporal, didn't refer to his physical stature either. It was a term of endearment from his soldiers, who appreciated that he treated them as equals. All of which is to say, Napoleon wasn't short, he was average. But Napoleon complex sounds much better than Napoleon perfectly normal height complex, so the myth endures. If anyone had told those bullying aristocratic boys that the weird Corsican kid they were mocking would one day rule their country, abolish their privileges, and reorganize their entire society, they would have laughed. History, it turns out, has an excellent sense of irony. Napoleon excelled at mathematics and, predictably, military subjects. He graduated from the prestigious École Militaire in Paris in 1785, finishing in 1 year instead of the usual 2. Because apparently even educational timelines couldn't contain his ambition, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the French artillery. Artillery was considered the least glamorous branch of the military by the aristocratic officer class, who preferred the cavalry, where you got to ride a horse and look dashing. Napoleon chose artillery because it was the most technical, the most mathematical, and the most meritocratic branch of the French army. It was also the branch where a poor Corsican nobody could advance based on talent rather than family connections. This choice would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in military history. Napoleon didn't just learn artillery, he mastered it. He became, in the opinion of virtually every military historian who has ever studied the subject, one of the greatest artillery tacticians who has ever lived. His understanding of how to position, move, and concentrate cannon fire to devastating effect would become the foundation of his entire military career. While other officers were learning which fork to use at dinner parties, Napoleon was calculating trajectories and rates of fire. It's not the most glamorous origin story, but it's an extremely effective one. And then, in 1789, everything changed. The French Revolution erupted, and the world Napoleon had been preparing to navigate, the orderly, hierarchical, aristocracy-dominated world of the Ancien Régime, was torn apart. For those who need a quick refresher, the French Revolution was what happens when you combine massive government debt, widespread famine, a wildly out-of-touch monarchy, an enraged populace, and Enlightenment philosophy into a single volatile mixture, and then light a match. The people of France, who had been living under an absolute monarchy that taxed them into poverty while the aristocracy lived in obscene luxury, we're talking about a queen who allegedly suggested that starving people eat cake, which is the kind of advice that gets your palace stormed, finally had enough. They stormed the Bastille. They overthrew the king. They declared a republic. They wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. They also, eventually, started cutting off a lot of heads because revolutions have a tendency to consume themselves. The Reign of Terror, which lasted from 1793 to 1794, saw thousands of people executed by guillotine, not just aristocrats, but also moderate revolutionaries, suspected counter-revolutionaries, while people who looked at someone suspiciously, and eventually the very man who had orchestrated the terror itself. The revolution was eating its own children with an appetite that would have impressed the Roman emperors. The Committee of Public Safety, which ran the terror, had a name that was impressively Orwellian, considering Orwell wouldn't be born for another 110 years. During these turbulent years, the young Napoleon kept his head down, literally, in the sense that he wanted to keep it attached to his body. The political landscape was a minefield. Supporting the wrong faction at the wrong time could get you executed. Napoleon navigated this with a combination of genuine revolutionary sympathy, opportunistic political calculation, and the simple fact that France needed competent military officers far more than it needed another headless corpse. He had a brief period of trouble when the political faction he had aligned with fell out of favor. He was briefly arrested and imprisoned in 1794, but he managed to avoid the guillotine and emerged from the chaos with his career and his neck intact. For Napoleon, the revolution was an opportunity. The revolution had destroyed the old system of aristocratic privilege that had kept talented but non-noble officers from advancing. The officer corps of the French army was hemorrhaging experienced leaders. Many aristocratic officers had either fled the country, been executed, or simply refused to serve a revolutionary government. This created a vacuum at the top of the military hierarchy, and vacuums, as both physics and political science teach us, tend to get filled. Napoleon, as a young officer of modest origins with genuine military talent and no aristocratic baggage, was perfectly positioned to fill that vacuum. He was also smart enough to align himself politically with the right faction at the right time, a skill he would deploy repeatedly throughout his career with an instinct that bordered on the supernatural. Napoleon's big break came in 1793 at the Siege of Toulon. The city, a major French naval port on the Mediterranean coast, had been seized by royalist forces, French citizens who wanted to restore the monarchy, and was being supported by British and Spanish naval forces. The revolutionary government needed to retake it, badly, both for strategic reasons and for the propaganda value of defeating the hated British. The original French artillery commander was wounded, and through a combination of connections, luck, and being in the right place at the right time, a phrase that will recur throughout Napoleon's career with suspicious frequency, the 24-year-old Captain Bonaparte was given command of the artillery. What happened next was the first demonstration of Napoleon's military genius on a meaningful stage. He devised a plan to capture a key fort that overlooked the harbor, arguing that if the French could position artillery on the heights above the port, they could make the harbor untenable for the British fleet. His superiors were skeptical. Napoleon was insistent. He was also right. After weeks of fierce fighting, during which Napoleon personally led troops in combat and was wounded by a British bayonet, because he was never the type to lead from behind, the fort was captured. French artillery rained fire down on the British ships in the harbor. The British fleet withdrew. Toulon fell. The royalist forces surrendered. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. To put that in context, most military officers at 24 are still figuring out how to fill out paperwork correctly. Napoleon was commanding armies. The siege of Toulon put his name on the map, or more accurately, it put his name in the dispatches that were read by the politicians in Paris, which was even more important. Napoleon's next critical moment came in October 1795, during a royalist uprising in Paris. The French government, at this point a body called the Directory, which had replaced the more radical revolutionary government after the end of the Reign of Terror, was under threat. A large mob of royalist sympathizers and disaffected citizens was marching on the Tuileries Palace, where the government was headquartered. The Directory needed someone to defend them, and they needed that someone fast. Through a series of connections and recommendations, and crucially, because many more senior officers wanted nothing to do with the politically toxic task of firing on French citizens, The job fell to Napoleon. What Napoleon did next has been debated by historians for 2 centuries, but the basic facts are clear. He positioned artillery at key intersections around the Tuileries, and when the mob approached, gave the order to fire. The cannon blasts, loaded with grape shot, essentially turning the cannons into enormous shotguns, tore through the crowd and ended the uprising in minutes. Napoleon famously described this as giving the mob a whiff of grape shot, which is the kind of casually brutal understatement that tells you a lot about the man. Yet he had just ordered cannon fire into a crowd of his own countrymen, and he described it as if he'd opened a window to let in some fresh air. The event was morally complicated. Defending an elected government is one thing, firing cannons into a crowd is another. But politically, it was a masterstroke. The Directory was now in Napoleon's debt. He had saved the government, and the government knew it. He was promoted to commander of the Army of the Interior, and more importantly, he was now a known figure in Parisian political circles. The Corsican outsider had become an insider. It was also around this time that Napoleon met Josephine de Beauharnais, a widowed aristocrat 6 years his senior with 2 children, considerable debts, and a social network that extended into the highest levels of Parisian society. Though Josephine had survived the revolution by the narrowest of margins, her first husband had been guillotined, and she herself had been imprisoned during the Terror, escaping execution by sheer luck when the political tide turned. She was glamorous, worldly, well-connected, and exactly the kind of person a young Corsican general with political ambitions needed in his life. Napoleon fell for her with an intensity that was, by all accounts, slightly alarming. His love letters to Josephine are among the most passionate and occasionally most embarrassing documents in the history of correspondence. "I awake full of you," he wrote in one letter. "Your image and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures has left no rest to my senses." He wrote to her constantly, sometimes multiple times a day, while she responded with considerably less frequency and enthusiasm, which seems to have only increased his ardor. Napoleon conquered nations more easily than he conquered his own wife's affection, which is either romantic or deeply sad, depending on your perspective. They married in March 1796 in a civil ceremony that Napoleon showed up late to because he was busy with military planning, which set the tone for the entire marriage. Josephine, for her part, lied about her age on the marriage certificate, knocking 4 years off. They were, in their own chaotic way, well matched. 2 days after his wedding, 2 days, Napoleon left Paris to take command of the French army of Italy. The army was tasked with fighting the Austrians and their allies in northern Italy. And it was, at the time, in terrible shape. The soldiers were underfed, underpaid, undersupplied, and deeply demoralized. Their previous commanders had achieved little. The campaign in Italy was considered a sideshow, a secondary front designed to distract the Austrians while the main French armies fought in Germany. Napoleon turned the sideshow into the main event. In one of the most brilliant military campaigns in history, Napoleon took his ragged, demoralized army and, over the course of roughly a year, defeated the Austrian and Sardinian forces in a series of battles that became textbook examples of military strategy. He moved his troops with staggering speed, concentrating his forces at key points to overwhelm numerically superior enemies before they could coordinate their defenses. He fought battle after battle, Montenotte, Lodi, Arcole, Rivoli, winning each one through a combination of tactical brilliance, personal bravery, and the ability to inspire his exhausted troops to keep fighting when every rational calculation said they should stop. At the Battle of Lodi, Napoleon personally led a charge across a bridge under heavy Austrian cannon fire, an act of such reckless bravery that his soldiers began calling him Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, a nickname of affection that stuck. It was at Lodi, Napoleon later claimed, that he first began to believe he was destined for greatness. Whether he actually said this or whether he invented it later for his memoirs, Napoleon was an enthusiastic editor of his own legend. The campaign in Italy was undeniably the moment when a talented young general became something more, a military phenomenon. By April 1797, Napoleon had forced Austria to sue for peace. He negotiated the Treaty of Campo Formio essentially on his own, without waiting for instructions from the Directory. Because waiting for instructions from politicians was not something Napoleon had much patience for. The treaty gave France significant territorial gains in Italy and the Low Countries, and established Napoleon as the dominant political and military figure in France. He was 27 years old. When he returned to Paris, he was greeted as a hero. The public adored him. The newspapers lionized him. The Directory regarded him with a mixture of gratitude and mounting unease, because having a wildly popular 27-year-old military genius wandering around Paris with nothing to do was the kind of situation that historically tended to end badly for governments. The Directory, eager to get Napoleon as far away from Paris as possible while still appearing to support him, approved his proposal for a military expedition to Egypt. The official justification was strategic. Conquering Egypt would threaten British trade routes to India and establish French influence in the eastern Mediterranean. The unofficial justification was simpler. Sending Napoleon to Africa meant he wasn't in Paris, scheming. Napoleon sailed for Egypt in May 1798 with roughly 40,000 troops, a fleet of warships, and, in a touch that reveals his intellectual ambitions, 167 scholars, scientists, engineers, and artists. This collection of intellectuals, known as the savants, would conduct the first systematic European study of Egyptian history, culture, and natural science. Their work eventually produced a massive multi-volume publication that essentially founded the modern field of Egyptology. One of the expedition's most famous discoveries was a particular inscribed stone that would eventually enable the deciphering of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, fundamentally changing our understanding of one of the world's oldest civilizations. The military side of the expedition was more mixed. Napoleon defeated the Egyptian Mamluk warriors at the Battle of the Pyramids, a victory he dramatized masterfully in his dispatches back to France, because Napoleon understood that controlling the narrative was almost as important as winning the battle. "Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you," he reportedly told his troops before the battle, gesturing at the pyramids. Whether he actually said this or made it up later for the memoirs is, again, debatable. Napoleon was the kind of man who recognized a great line and wasn't going to let the truth get in the way of a perfect quote. However, the naval side of the expedition was a disaster. Shortly after Napoleon landed in Egypt, the British fleet under Admiral Nelson found and destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, stranding Napoleon's army in Egypt with no way home. This was, to put it mildly, a problem. Napoleon was stuck in a desert on another continent with no supply line and no ride back. He responded by doing what Napoleon always did when things went wrong. He attacked. He led his army into Syria, fought several battles, besieged the fortress of Acre, or failed to take it, one of the few sieges he ever lost, and eventually retreated back to Egypt with his army significantly reduced by combat, disease, and the brutal Middle Eastern heat. Then, in August 1799, Napoleon received news from France that changed everything. The political situation in Paris had deteriorated dramatically. The Directory was collapsing. French armies were losing ground in Europe. The country was in crisis. Napoleon saw his moment. He abandoned his army in Egypt, simply left 30,000 troops stranded in a foreign country with no commander, which is the kind of thing that would end most military careers, but which Napoleon somehow turned into a narrative of urgency and patriotism, and sailed back to France on a fast frigate, dodging the British blockade through a combination of luck and favorable winds. Napoleon arrived back in Paris in October 1799, and the timing could not have been more perfect. France was a mess. The Directory, the five-man executive body that had governed France since 1795, had proven spectacularly incompetent. Corruption was rampant. The economy was in shambles. French armies were losing battles across Europe. The public was exhausted, disillusioned, and desperate for stable leadership. The idealism of the revolution had long since given way to cynicism, and most French citizens didn't particularly care who governed them, as long as whoever it was could keep the streets safe, the bread affordable, and the Austrians out of France. Several politicians in the Directory had already been plotting to overthrow the government and replace it with something more efficient, a polite word that, what in the political vocabulary of post-revolutionary France usually meant authoritarian. They needed a military figure to give the coup legitimacy and muscle. Napoleon was their man. The coup took place on November 9th to 10th, 1799, corresponding to 18 to 19 Brumaire on the French revolutionary calendar, because the revolution had, among its many ambitious projects, completely redesigned the calendar. The new calendar featured months with names like Thermidor, hot, Nivose, snowy, and Brumaire, foggy, which sounds charmingly meteorological until you realize it also made dating your checks incredibly confusing. The coup was supposed to be smooth, dignified, and bloodless. It was none of these things. On the first day, Napoleon and his co-conspirators convinced one chamber of the legislature to move its session to a palace outside Paris, ostensibly for security reasons. So far, so good. On the second day, Napoleon was supposed to address the other chamber, the Council of 500, and persuade them to dissolve the Directory and transfer power to a new government. Instead, when he walked into the chamber, the legislators started shouting at him, shoving him, and, according to some accounts, physically attacking him. One legislator allegedly grabbed Napoleon by his collar. Napoleon, who had charged across bridges under cannon fire without flinching, apparently had a much harder time dealing with angry politicians at close range and had to be rescued by his grenadiers. His brother, Napoleon Bonaparte, who happened to be the president of the Council of 500, a convenient coincidence that was absolutely not a coincidence, saved the situation. He went outside. He told the waiting soldiers that the legislators inside were threatening Napoleon's life and ordered them to clear the chamber. The soldiers marched in with bayonets fixed. The legislators fled, some of them jumping out of windows in their haste to escape, which is a mental image that never gets old. A rump session of compliant legislators was then hastily assembled, and they voted to dissolve the Directory and establish a new government. The new government was called the Consulate, headed by 3 consuls. Napoleon was named first consul. On paper, it was a shared leadership. In practice, everyone, including the other 2 consuls, understood that Napoleon was in charge. He was 30 years old. As first consul, Napoleon moved with characteristic speed to consolidate his power and reshape France. If the revolution had torn down the old order, Napoleon's task was to build a new one that preserved the revolution's core principles of legal equality, meritocracy, and the abolition of feudal privilege, while also establishing the strong, centralized authority that he believed France desperately needed. The most enduring achievement of this period, and arguably of Napoleon's entire career, was the Civil Code, promulgated in 1804. This was a comprehensive overhaul of French law that replaced the patchwork of regional customs, feudal laws, and revolutionary decrees that had governed France for centuries with a single, rational, unified legal system. The Code established the principle of equality before the law, guaranteed religious freedom, protected property rights, and codified the abolition of feudal privileges. It was exported, voluntarily or by force, to virtually every country Napoleon conquered, and it became the foundation of legal systems across Europe, Latin America, and beyond. If Napoleon had done nothing else in his entire life, no battles, no conquests, no empire, the Civil Code alone would have earned him a place in history. He also reformed France's administrative system, creating the system of prefects, centrally appointed regional governors, that still exists in France today. He established the Bank of France, he reformed the tax system, he negotiated a concordat with the Pope that resolved the bitter conflict between the revolutionary government and the Catholic Church, allowing France's Catholic majority to practice their faith while maintaining the state's supremacy over the Church. He founded a new system of public education, then including the lycées that remain the backbone of French secondary education. He built roads, bridges, and canals. He commissioned architectural projects that still define the Parisian landscape. The sheer volume of institutional reform Napoleon accomplished in his first few years as first consul is staggering. He worked 18-hour days, dictated hundreds of letters, and involved himself in details ranging from the design of military uniforms to the regulation of theater performances. His energy was, by all accounts, terrifying. Ministers and secretaries struggled to keep up with him. He slept 4 to 5 hours a night, took brief naps during the day, and consumed information at a rate that suggested his brain operated on a fundamentally different clock speed than everyone else's. He also, during this period, won the Battle of Marengo in June 1800, a close-fought engagement in northern Italy that secured his political position at home by demonstrating that Napoleon, the politician, was still Napoleon, the general. The battle itself was nearly a disaster. The Austrians surprised the French forces and came close to routing them before reinforcements arrived at the last possible moment. Napoleon, with his characteristic talent for self-promotion, later had the battle's history rewritten to make it appear as though his victory had been part of a brilliant plan rather than a last-minute rescue. The gap between what actually happened at Marengo and Napoleon's official version of events is wide enough to drive a horse-drawn artillery caisson through. By 1804, Napoleon had accumulated so much power that the title of First Consul no longer seemed adequate. A national plebiscite, a public vote, was held on whether to make Napoleon Emperor of the French. The result was overwhelmingly in favor, though, like most plebiscites held under authoritarian governments, the process was not exactly a model of democratic transparency. The vote was conducted openly rather than by secret ballot. Government officials were pressured to ensure a favorable result, and military units voted in blocks under the watchful eyes of their commanding officers. Shockingly, the result was 99.93% in favor. Democracy in action. The coronation ceremony, held on December 2, 1804, at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, was one of the most extraordinary spectacles in European history. Napoleon had invited the Pope himself to preside over the ceremony, which might seem like a gesture of religious humility until you learn what happened next. At the crucial moment, instead of allowing the Pope to place the crown on his head, as tradition dictated, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. The symbolism was unmistakable and entirely intentional. Napoleon owed his power to no one. Not to God, not to the Pope, not to the Church, not to any hereditary right. He had taken power himself, and he would crown himself. It was an act of such breathtaking audacity that even the Pope, who had traveled all the way from Rome for this ceremony, could only sit there and watch. Several witnesses reported that the pontiff looked distinctly uncomfortable, which seems like an understatement for a man who had just been publicly upstaged at his own spiritual workplace. Napoleon then crowned his wife as empress, and the ceremony concluded with enough pomp, military display, and imperial pageantry to make the old Bourbon monarchs look like minimalists. The Corsican outsider, who had been bullied for his accent and mocked for his poverty, was now Emperor of the French. He was 35 years old. What followed was, even by Napoleon's extraordinary standards, a period of almost inconceivable military and political achievement. In 1805, Napoleon faced a coalition of European powers, Britain, Austria, and Russia, determined to contain his expanding empire. He responded by executing one of the most brilliant military campaigns in history. In a series of lightning-fast marches, he moved his entire army from the English Channel, where they had been preparing for a never-executed invasion of Britain, to Central Europe. He surrounded and destroyed an entire Austrian army at the Battle of Ulm in October 1805, capturing 30,000 troops virtually without a fight, which is the military equivalent of winning a chess game in 3 moves. Then came Austerlitz. On December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon faced a combined Russian and Austrian army at the Battle of Austerlitz, in what is now the Czech Republic. The battle is widely considered the greatest tactical victory of his career and one of the greatest in military history. Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank to lure the Allied forces into attacking it, then launched his main assault against the enemy center, splitting their army in two and destroying it in detail. The victory was so complete, so decisive, and so elegantly executed that military academies around the world still study it today. If Napoleon had written a resume, Austerlitz would have been the first line. He followed this with equally devastating victories against Prussia at Jena-Auerstedt in 1806, where he destroyed the Prussian army, once considered the finest in Europe, in a single day, and against Russia at Friedland in 1807, which forced the Tsar to negotiate peace. By 1807, Napoleon was the master of continental Europe. He had defeated every major European power except Britain, which, protected by the English Channel and the Royal Navy, remained frustratingly out of reach, like a smug island sitting just offshore, refusing to be conquered. Napoleon's empire, at its height around 1811, directly controlled France, Belgium, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, parts of Italy, and parts of Spain. His satellite states, allies, and vassal kingdoms extended his influence across virtually the entire continent. His brothers sat on the thrones of Spain, Holland, and Westphalia. His marshals governed provinces from Portugal to Poland. The map of Europe had been redrawn in his image. But empires built on military conquest have a fundamental problem. They require continuous military success to survive. The moment the conquests stop, or worse, start to fail, the entire structure begins to unravel. And for Napoleon, the unraveling began in two places, Spain and Russia. The Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon called it, began in 1808 when he deposed the Spanish royal family and installed his brother on the throne. The Spanish people, who had not been consulted about this arrangement and were not particularly enthusiastic about it, launched a savage guerrilla war that tied down hundreds of thousands of French troops for 6 years and bled the empire of men and resources. The word guerrilla itself comes from this conflict. It means little war in Spanish, which is ironic given how much damage it did. And then there was Russia. In June 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with roughly 600,000 troops, the largest army ever assembled in European history up to that point. The campaign was a catastrophe of almost mythological proportions. The Russians refused to fight a decisive battle, instead retreating deeper and deeper into their own territory, burning crops and villages as they went, denying Napoleon the quick, decisive victory he needed. When the French finally reached Moscow in September, they found the city abandoned and on fire. Napoleon waited in the burning ruins for 5 weeks, hoping the Tsar would negotiate. The Tsar did not negotiate. The retreat from Moscow, beginning in October 1812, is one of the most horrific episodes in military history. The French army, starving, freezing, and harassed by Russian cavalry and partisan fighters, disintegrated as it marched westward through the Russian winter. Soldiers froze to death in their tracks. Horses died by the thousands. Entire units simply ceased to exist. Of the roughly 600,000 men who had crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. The rest were dead, captured, or missing. Napoleon survived the disaster, raced back to Paris, raised a new army, and fought on for another 2 years against a coalition of every major European power. He won several more battles because he was still Napoleon, but the numbers were now against him, and even his genius couldn't overcome the combined resources of Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, all fighting him simultaneously. In April 1814, his marshals, exhausted and demoralized, refused to fight any longer. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba, a small territory off the coast of Italy that the Allies generously allowed him to rule as a miniature kingdom. For most people, this would have been the end of the story. Napoleon was not most people. In March 1815, he escaped from Elba, landed in southern France with about 1,000 men, and marched north toward Paris. The army sent to stop him defected to his side. The king fled. Napoleon entered Paris in triumph and reclaimed the throne, launching the extraordinary period known as the 100 Days. It ended at Waterloo on June 18, 1815, where a combined British and Prussian force defeated him in a battle that was, by Wellington's own admission, the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. The battle itself was a grinding, bloody affair that could have gone either way at several points. Napoleon's tactical plan was sound: defeat the British before the Prussians could arrive to reinforce them. But a combination of delays, miscommunications, and the dogged resistance of the British infantry under Wellington, who spent the entire day calmly repositioning his forces while cannonballs flew around him with the casual indifference of a man who had accepted that death was statistically likely, prevented Napoleon from breaking through. When the Prussians finally arrived on Napoleon's right flank late in the afternoon, the battle was lost. Napoleon returned to Paris, abdicated for the second and final time, and briefly considered fleeing to the United States, an alternate timeline that would have produced the most remarkable immigration story in American history. Instead, he surrendered to the British, apparently hoping for a dignified exile in England. The British had other ideas. He was exiled to St. Helena, a remote volcanic island in the middle of the South Atlantic, roughly 1,200 miles off the coast of Africa, and accessible only by a miserable sea voyage. There was absolutely no chance of escape this time, which was rather the point. He spent the last 6 years of his life there, dictating his memoirs to a small entourage of loyal followers, arguing incessantly with his British captors, particularly the governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, whom Napoleon despised with a passion that bordered on the recreational, gardening, and carefully reshaping his own legend for posterity. The memoirs Napoleon dictated on St. Helena were masterpieces of self-promotion, selectively editing his career to emphasize his achievements and minimize his failures. He presented himself as the champion of the revolution, the liberator of nations, the man who had tried to unite Europe under rational, enlightened governance but had been brought down by the jealousy and backwardness of the old monarchies. It was, at best, a partial truth, but it was told with such conviction and skill that it shaped how generations understood him. He died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, most likely of stomach cancer, though conspiracy theories about arsenic poisoning have persisted for 2 centuries. His last words are disputed. Some sources claim he said, "France, the army, the head of the army, Josephine," which is either poignant or incoherent, depending on how generous you're feeling. His body was eventually returned to Paris in 1840 and placed in an enormous tomb at Les Invalides, where it remains to this day, visited by millions of tourists who stand in the rotunda and look down at the sarcophagus of the man who, for better and worse, they made the modern world. So, to recap, a minor Corsican nobleman with no money and a funny accent used the chaos of the French Revolution to launch a military career of unprecedented brilliance, overthrew the government in a coup that nearly failed when angry legislators tried to beat him up, crowned himself emperor in front of a pope he had personally invited just so he could upstage him, conquered most of Europe through a series of military campaigns that are still studied at every war college on the planet, reformed France's legal, educational, and administrative systems so thoroughly that most of his institutional reforms are still in place today, invaded Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen and lost it almost entirely, was exiled, escaped, reclaimed his throne, lost at Waterloo, and died on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. That is, by any standard, a life. Napoleon's legacy is vast, complicated, and still fiercely debated. The civil code remains the foundation of legal systems in dozens of countries. The administrative structures he created in France endure. The principle of meritocracy he championed, advancement based on talent rather than birth, reshaped European society permanently. The nationalist movements he inadvertently sparked across Europe, by redrawing borders and demonstrating that old dynasties could be overthrown, would eventually lead to the unification of Germany and Italy and the emergence of the modern nation-state system. On the other hand, Napoleon's wars killed somewhere between 3 and 6 million people, depending on which estimates you use and whether you include the indirect deaths from famine, disease, and economic disruption that accompanied his campaigns. And he reinstated slavery in the French colonies after the Revolution had abolished it, a decision that is as morally indefensible as it sounds and that often gets glossed over in the more hagiographic accounts of his career. He suppressed press freedom with an enthusiasm that would make modern autocrats nod approvingly. He established a police state run by a minister whose surveillance network made Orwell's Big Brother look like a casual observer. He was an authoritarian who believed in liberty mostly for himself and in equality mostly in the sense that everyone was equally subject to his will. He was, in the end, a man of extraordinary talent and extraordinary ambition, born into a moment of extraordinary upheaval, who seized the opportunities that chaos presented and rode them further than anyone thought possible. He proved that a single individual with enough intelligence, will, and ruthlessness could reshape the world. Whether that's an inspiring lesson or a terrifying one depends entirely on your perspective. What's not debatable is that Napoleon matters. 200 years after his death, we still argue about him, study him, and make videos about him. The kid from Corsica who was too poor, too foreign, and too short, well, actually average height, to be taken seriously by anyone, ended up reshaping the legal, political, and military landscape of an entire continent and leaving a mark on history that shows absolutely no sign of fading. And it all started with a boy who was really, really good at math and really, really bad at accepting his place in the world. Did you know these details about Napoleon's rise to power? If not, but what surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And in the meantime, check out our video on the full life story of Lionel Messi, or this one instead.